Why are 3 warships surrounding my ship?
Because you didn't buy a ship, Marcus.
Then what did I buy?
Your purchase activated an ancient bond, Marcus.
A bond? What kind of bond?
The kind your species calls marriage. You still don't understand, human. You're not marrying just one of us.
Wait, all 3 of you?
All 3. And the wedding is the easy part.
Marcus Webb had spent 11 years reading contracts that other people couldn't be bothered to read, and the most important thing those 11 years had taught him was that the problem was almost never in the terms that everyone argued about. The problem was in the definition section, or in a subordinate clause buried in an exhibit nobody opened, or memorably, on one Tuesday at 11:15, while eating a turkey sandwich in a semicolon, used where a period should have been, on page 437 of a merger agreement, which technically meant that one company had accidentally transferred the mineral extraction rights of a small Pacific island to the wrong subsidiary. He had caught it. He had flagged it. He had written a memo about it that prevented a $17 million dispute before it happened, and 3 weeks later he had been included in a round of restructuring that the firm described as a recalibration of human capital allocation. That was firm number 3. The first 2 had been restructuring and downsizing, respectively, over an 11-year span, during which Marcus had developed a comprehensive working knowledge of how badly things could go wrong in writing and a gradually deepening conviction that it didn't much matter. He had signed the severance package without reading it. He had signed the lease termination on his Denver apartment without reading it. He had signed the storage unit agreement and the vehicle sublease and the forwarding address form and half a dozen other administrative closings on what had been a life, all without reading any of them, because he knew what those documents looked like. And the part of his brain that had made him genuinely good at his job had gone somewhere quiet about 14 months ago and stopped taking his calls. The ship had woken something up. He couldn't explain it better than that. He had been in the Traveler Services Hall at Titanport, eating something from a vending unit that claimed to be a sandwich, watching a cargo freighter offload through the wide observation window and feeling the particular blankness of someone who is physically present in a place and mentally somewhere much less specific. Then a small quick man sat down beside him with the practiced ease of someone who needed this conversation to happen in the next 3 minutes or not at all. "Ship," the man said. "Not you want a ship, or I have a ship for sale. Just ship, like it was a password." Marcus looked at him. "I don't know how to fly. Mostly automated. Old systems, but stable, good bones, solid pressure seals." "History," the man said, with the compressed speech of someone who had more thoughts than available seconds. "4-2. Credits?" Credits. Marcus had 4,800 credits in the account he'd set up after selling the Denver apartment and canceling his various subscriptions. He thought about this for approximately 10 seconds, which in retrospect was an absurdly short deliberation period for the purchase of a spacecraft, and said, "Deal." The transaction processed in under 90 seconds. The man handed Marcus a physical key, solid old, heavy in a way that suggested the metal was genuinely dense, stamped with a registration number he didn't look at closely, and stood up. "Berth 47. Everything you need's in the registry files." He paused at the edge of the pause. "Good luck." He was walking away before Marcus could ask what luck was specifically needed for. Old habit, Marcus lifted his phone and photographed the man's back as he moved through the crowd. He photographed the transaction receipt, the berth assignment printout, and the key in his palm before he put it in his pocket. The habit had started during an optimistic period in his early 30s when he'd bought a very good camera with the intention of traveling seriously and documenting all of it. The traveling had never materialized, but the photographing had stuck people, signs, interesting textures, anyone he'd spoken to for more than a few minutes, anything that might be worth having evidence of later. He had tens of thousands of photographs on his phone and could not have told you the purpose of most of them, except that taking them made him feel present in a way that most things currently did not. He picked up the bag that contained everything he'd kept from Denver and went to find berth 47. The ship had survived several centuries through what Marcus could only characterize as sheer structural stubbornness. The hull was pewter gray beneath overlapping coats of exterior sealant applied across shades in 4 different colors that did not quite match by whoever had owned her when the previous coat started failing. There was a long scrape along the starboard side that had been filled with bonding compound and sanded imperfectly smooth. The landing struts were clearly not original equipment and were not all from the same source. The communication array on the dorsal surface looked like it had been serviced much more recently than anything else, which Marcus noted as incongruous without knowing quite what to do with it. The pressure seal indicators on the boarding ramp were green. He could see that from the ground. He walked the hull perimeter before going inside, running his eyes across the plating, checking the sensor pods present, intact, paint blistering slightly around 2 of them, but the pods themselves solid, and looking at the overall structural condition, which was acceptable. Not impressive, but acceptable. The bones were there. Someone had lettered Galactic Wanderer across the prow in confident block capitals. The paint was perhaps 5 years old. Beneath it, under that coat and the ones before it, the original paint was showing through in a few spots where the outer sealant had cracked and curled at the edges. He stopped at the nose section and looked at the fragments of the original inscription, a curve of capital letters in a style that seemed older than the ship had any right to be. He could make out part of it. Something like Diane AC. Marcus stood there for a moment, with the mild itching sense of something he should recognize but didn't. He photographed it anyway, and filed it under interesting texture, and went inside. The interior was cramped in the way of things designed for function rather than comfort, organized with the accumulated logic of long use. Cockpit forward with a pilot's chair and a secondary console to the right. A narrow passage aft led to a sleeping cabin with a bunk that was scaled for someone several inches taller than Marcus. A small galley with cooking equipment he had no idea how to use. 3 cargo bays in descending size, and at the rear of the ship, past the aft cargo bay, a heavy door with a lock that the key he'd been given didn't open. No label on the panel beside it. It took him 23 minutes to find the bathroom. 3rd corridor, left at the equipment locker. Blue panel, pressed twice. He sat in the pilot's chair. It creaked in a way that had character if not exactly confidence, and looked at the console. More complex than he'd expected. He identified the main power readout and what appeared to be an atmospheric display showing internal air composition as within normal parameters, and a navigation screen with his current position marked and nothing else filled in. There were a significant number of buttons without labels. He pressed one experimentally. It produced a sound that made him straighten immediately, as if the ship were clearing its throat about something serious. He pressed it again, and it stopped. He made a mental note. The proximity alert went off 2 minutes later, which was a persistent soft tone and a pulsing amber light along the console edge. 3 contacts on the sensor display emerged from transit at vectors, forming a loose triangle around him. Each was substantially larger than the vessel he was sitting in. He could see them through the cockpit viewport. 3 ships, each a completely different design, none sharing insignia or configuration, positioned with the settled precision of something planned in advance. "Okay," Marcus said to the empty cockpit. "That's probably fine." The communication panel lit up on all 3 channels simultaneously. He pressed General Receive because it was the only labeled button he'd found so far. Human. 3 voices, not quite simultaneous, offset by perhaps half a second in a way that made the words seem to come from the ship itself, surrounding him with it. 3 screens activated. The first face he would have described, if pressed, as composed in the way of something that had practiced composure, until composure became infrastructure. She was tall enough that even the proportions of her command chair gave it away, scaled significantly upward from anything built for a human. Her skin shifted between silver and deep blue as she moved, iridescent in the cabin light, and her features had a geometric precision to them, every line clean and purposeful. Her hair was white and pulled straight back without ornamentation. Her uniform was covered in rank insignia in a language of shapes he couldn't read, but there was a great deal of it. "I am Commander Velhari of the Keth Dominion," she said. Each word was given its full weight and nothing extra. "You are in possession of a vessel registered as Galactic Wanderer 2, registry number 7741 Theka, previously known as the Viridian Accord. Confirm." "I bought it this morning," Marcus said. "The registration transfer should have gone through. I have the receipt if there's a problem with the transfer is not in question," Velhari said. "What the transfer means is," the second speaker had the patience of something that had been alive long enough to stop being impatient with the pace of events. She was slightly shorter than the first, perhaps 2.5 meters, with deep amber skin the color of old honey that caught the cockpit light with its own quality. Her face held 4 eyes arranged in vertical pairs, and all 4 were looking at Marcus with the particular calm of something that has observed a great many unexpected things, and is simply noting that here is another one. She wore layered robes in cream and ochre, and she held herself with the stillness of long practice. "I am Elder Sora of the Conclave of Reaching Stars," she said. Her voice had a harmonic in it, a low resonance that seemed to persist in the air of the cockpit even through the speakers. The way a bell persists after the strike. The stewardship of the Viridian Accord has passed to others before, across the long span of years. We did not know when it would pass again, or to whom. She paused, and her 4 eyes moved, not to Marcus's face, but to the hull of the ship, looking at it the way someone looks at a thing they remember from a very old story that they had started to doubt was real. Now we know. Marcus noticed this. He filed it. The third woman did not wait for her designated moment. She entered the frame from the side of her command deck, having clearly been somewhere other than the command chair when the call connected, and she crossed the screen in 3 strides that covered significant distance because her stride was significant. She was the tallest of the 3 by a margin that made the already tall first 2 seem almost reasonable, nearly 3 meters, with deep forest green skin and silver hair cropped short against her skull. Her jacket was clearly military but carried no rank, only a simple geometric mark on the breast. She looked at Marcus with the expression of someone who has been briefed on a situation and found the briefing insufficient. "Rin," she said, "champion of the Free Worlds Coalition, I'm skipping the ceremony because we're losing time." "Do you know what you bought?" "A spaceship," Marcus said. "A very old one with some kind of infestation in the port cargo bay that I haven't addressed yet." Rin stopped. "It's not wasps." "What is it?" "Velgrubs. Nesting pair. They eat corrosion byproducts. Harmless. Think of them as free maintenance." She paused, then very deliberately redirected. "The point isn't the grubs. The point is what you're sitting in." Vilhari leaned forward the minimal amount required to indicate that she was about to say something important. "The vessel you now own is the Viridian Accord. 63 meters. Diplomatic configuration. Class 7 auxiliary hull. Registered in the 91st year of the current galactic calendar. Present at the signing of the Galactic Compact 9,014 years ago." Her voice had the cadence of someone reciting something that has been recited before, many times, in other contexts, and the recitation is never casual. Under Section 4, Article 17 of the Galactic Compact, the recognized steward of this vessel holds the sole living veto power over any formal declaration of armed conflict between member species. Marcus sat in the creaking pilot's chair and allowed this information to settle into him the way heavy things settle into water, not quickly, and with some displacement. "I paid 4,200 credits for it," he said. "Yes," Sora said. She said it in the exact tone of someone who is aware of the full context and finds one specific element of it notable in a way she is not yet prepared to explain. The silence that followed had weight. "The man who sold it to me left very quickly," Marcus said slowly. "I photographed him on his way out. He didn't look back once." "That would be consistent," Vilhari said, "with the careful neutrality of someone who has strong opinions and has elected to hold them professionally, with someone who understood the implications of the vessel's ownership and resolved to make them someone else's difficulty." Marcus thought about this. He thought about the transaction completed in under 90 seconds, and the key handed over without ceremony, and the words "good luck" delivered as the man was already leaving. He thought about the communication array on the dorsal surface that had been maintained very recently while everything else was years behind schedule. "What does this mean for me?" he said. "Right now, concretely, today." The 3 women looked at each other across 3 separate screens. It was a fractional moment, a recalibration. Marcus would have called it if he were in a conference room, which he had been for 11 years, and he recognized the shape of prepared people encountering an unexpected angle of entry. Vilhari spoke. "Under compact law, a formal bonding compact between the compact steward and a recognized head of state or designated champion of a member species creates a diplomatic co-stewardship. Both parties hold joint steward rights and responsibilities. It is the most binding form of political treaty available within the compact. Marcus listened to the complete sentence. You want to marry me, he said. The Keth Dominion requires a formal alliance with the compact steward, Velhari said, which was not technically what he'd asked. All three of you, Marcus said. 3 separate bonding compacts, Sora said, each legally distinct. The compact permits plural stewardship arrangements. Historical precedent exists. Each of you separately, yes, but at the same time. The compacts would not be executed simultaneously, Velhari said. They would be concurrent in effect. The distinction is legally significant. Marcus looked at screen 1, then screen 2, then screen 3. 3 alien women looked back at him, across 3 channels from 3 warships that were holding position outside with the patience of things that do not need to hurry. Lady, he said, and the word was addressed to no one of them specifically, and all of them at once. I just bought this ship yesterday. I don't even know where the bathroom is yet. 3rd corridor, Rin said without hesitation. Left at the equipment locker. Blue panel. Press it twice. A brief silence fell across all 3 screens. I have schematics, Rin said. She did not appear to feel this required further explanation. Before Marcus could think of a response adequate to the experience of receiving bathroom directions from a 3-meter alien champion who had arrived to propose marriage, the communication panel added a 4th incoming signal. He hadn't noticed the small ship in the outer docking ring. It had been there on his sensor display the whole time, sitting still and quiet, and his brain had categorized it as docking traffic and moved on. Looking back at the display now, he could see it clearly, a sleek, dark-hulled vessel, built in a style different from the 3 warships, and different from anything else currently in port. Bearing a sigil, he didn't recognize a hand holding a perfectly balanced scale, the 2 sides in exact equilibrium. The person who appeared on the 4th screen was almost human, almost, in the specific way that made him more immediately unsettling than the 3 women who were clearly and entirely not. Approximately human in proportion, with pale gray skin that held a faint translucency. If you looked at the back of his hand, you might be able to see the structure beneath, and eyes that were solid silver, edge to edge, with no distinction of iris or pupil. He wore an immaculate suit, and he was smiling in the careful way of someone who had thought about this moment in advance, and felt confident about how it was going. Mr. Webb, he said. Marcus, if I may. I'm Grand Administrator Kalek, representing the Vrath hegemony. I want you to know that I arrived today specifically as a resource, not a complication. The smile remained precisely where it had started. You look like a man who could use a friendly face. Marcus looked at 4 screens. He looked through the viewport at 3 warships and 1 quiet, dark vessel. He noted that Kalek's ship had been here before the 3 warships arrived. He had been in position, waiting, already knowing Marcus's name. He had introduced himself as a friend without being asked, which was something that genuine friends did not actually do because it did not occur to them to clarify. I've had a very long morning, Marcus Webb said. He picked up his phone, angled it toward the screens, and took a photograph of Kalek's face. Kalek's smile didn't shift. The silver eyes didn't blink. He simply waited, as if being photographed was something that happened to him often, and he had long ago stopped having opinions about it. Marcus lowered his phone and looked at the 4 screens again, and then at the cracked and resanded edges of his viewport, and then at the console with its unlabeled buttons, and then at his own hands, which were, he noted, not shaking. Okay, he said, somebody explain all of this to me from the beginning. And whoever goes first, please go slow. Getting the Viridian Accord, which Marcus was still calling the Galactic Wanderer 2 internally, because he'd paid for it, and had not yet updated his internal filing system out of Berth 47 and into navigable space, turned out to require significantly more consultation than the phrase mostly automated had suggested. Rin had come aboard first, uninvited, because she apparently had the schematics and had decided that watching Marcus press buttons without context was an inefficient use of what she described as a critically short timeline. She was standing in the cockpit behind his chair, which was physically possible if she angled herself slightly given the ceiling height, and she was watching him try to identify the correct startup sequence with the expression of someone who is wrestling with the decision of whether to intervene or whether intervening would establish a precedent she didn't want to establish. The blue panel on the left, she said, when he had been looking at the wrong panel for what she apparently decided was long enough. Not the main blue. The one at the lower left that looks like it might be a trim adjustment. How many blue panels does this ship have? 7. This becomes less confusing once you've been aboard for more than an hour. That's not the reassurance you think it is. She made a sound in the back of her throat that might have been a laugh in a being who was less irritated with the situation. Press it once and hold. 2 seconds. Then the sequence starts automatically. He did. The Viridian Accord hummed with the deep structural resonance of something that had been dormant for a while and was now remembering what it was built for. The drive cores which the readout confirmed were intact. Even if they smelled faintly of something, Marcus decided not to identify, came online in a progression of amber lights becoming green. The navigation display populated with actual data. The atmospheric system cycled. A warning in a language he didn't read appeared briefly and then disappeared when the system apparently determined the warning was no longer relevant. What did that say? Calibration reminder, Rin said. Ignore it. The system has been waiting long enough to be slightly dramatic about startup. The ship is dramatic. The ship is 9,000 years old. It's earned some eccentricity. She paused, and something in her voice shifted. Barely enough to notice, but enough that he noticed it. Treat it with care. Not because it's fragile, because it's significant. He filed that too. Vilhari declined to board, citing the diplomatic impropriety of entering the vessel without a formal invitation protocol that apparently involved several steps Marcus had not yet been briefed on. She communicated instead via the comm channel from her own ship, which maintained formation with them as they pulled out of the port's approach corridor and into the buffer zone between Titan's gravitational anchor and the transit lanes. Elder Sora also communicated from her ship, which maintained position to the port, while Rin had apparently decided that practical considerations outweighed protocol. Kalek's dark ship moved with them, not aggressively, not at any specific distance, just present, the way a shadow is present there, because the light is coming from a particular direction. The first private conversation was Velhari's. Velhari's face appeared on the secondary console screen. Rin had retreated to the aft cargo bay to give them what she called operational space, and what Marcus recognized as the minimum viable distance for a conversation to be private. And Velhari's 4 sentences of preamble were so efficient that Marcus almost missed the actual pitch inside them. You are not a soldier, Velhari said. You are not a diplomat. You are not, by any measure I can identify, a person who expects to be in this situation today. That is, in fact, why the Keth Dominion's offer represents a genuine arrangement rather than a strategic fiction. She looked at him with those pale, precise eyes. We don't need a warrior. We need an anchor. The steward's vote has not been cast in 9,000 years. There are 3 species at this table who have been in a cold conflict for the last 2 centuries. If the steward votes, we need to ensure that vote reflects the interests of the compact as a whole, not the interests of a single faction. A co-stewardship with the Dominion means you have counsel when you need it, and protection when you need it, and we have the assurance that the cold conflict does not become a hot one. Marcus thought about this. You're describing a marriage as a conflict prevention mechanism. I am describing it accurately, Velhari said, which is more than the others will do. What the others did when their turns came was different in method and identical in underlying structure. Sora spoke to him in the galley, while he was trying to make something from the provisions list he'd found in a cabinet, which involved guessing at equipment functions with partial success. She came aboard quietly, with the ease of someone accustomed to entering spaces without disrupting them, and she sat across the small galley table from him, with her 4 hands folded in her lap and her 4 eyes fixed on him, with a quality of attention that felt less like scrutiny and more like careful memory. You feel like a mistake, she said, in the way that large events sometimes choose their instruments. Not because the instrument is flawed, but because the instrument hasn't yet understood what it's been handed. Marcus set down what he was holding. You can tell that? I've been alive for 412 years, Sora said. I have watched the moment of recognition arrive in a great many beings. It always feels like a mistake at first, because the scale of what is being asked is so much larger than the scale of the self that has been asked. She paused, and something that was not quite sadness moved through her expression. The conclave doesn't need a warrior or an anchor. We need someone who will still be asking questions in 20 years. Someone the compact can grow around rather than calcify around. You have not yet decided who you are in this situation. That is not a weakness. That is space. Space for what? For something better than what any of us came here planning, she said. Rin's conversation was shortest. She found him in the cockpit 40 minutes later. She had apparently given herself a tour of the ship, while the others spoke with him, which Marcus suspected was not accidental, and she stood in the doorway rather than coming in, as if she hadn't decided yet whether this was a conversation she was going to have. I'm not going to tell you the Free Worlds Coalition is something it isn't, she said. We're a collective of 17 inhabited systems that have one thing in common, which is that none of us want to be absorbed by anyone else. The compact protects that. If the compact fails, we don't have the fleet power to protect it ourselves. Her jaw tightened slightly, the way it does in someone who is being honest about something that costs them. I need the co-stewardship because I need a lever on the process. I'm not going to dress it up as anything else. But I want you to know that if you say yes to this arrangement, the Free Worlds Coalition will honor it exactly as written. We have a history of that. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he said, You tried to warn me back at the port when we first connected. You started to say something before I interrupted. Yes. What were you going to say? She was quiet for 3 full seconds. That it had already started, she said finally. Whatever they were planning. That you had probably already been contacted by someone who wasn't one of us. The comm panel pinged. Collects channel. Marcus, Kalik's voice said through the speakers, with the warm familiarity of someone who had decided first names were the right register. I apologize for the interruption, but I've taken the liberty of having some paperwork drawn up that might simplify your situation considerably. Standard registration documentation. It formalizes your custodial status and gives you some legal breathing room while you consider your options. My shuttle can bring it over at your convenience. Rin's head turned toward the comm panel with a precision that Marcus associated with weapons targeting. Tell him you need time to review it, she said. Marcus held her gaze. Then he looked at the comm panel. The Vrath shuttle was already in approach. He could see it on the sensor display. It had been moving before Kalik finished speaking. I'll come to the shuttle bay, Marcus said into the comm. Rin followed him without being asked. She did not say anything more, which was, he would reflect later, because she didn't know enough of the specific shape of the danger to make the case clearly, and she had decided that telling him, don't trust Kalik, without evidence was the kind of warning he would hear and set aside, because 3 giant alien women had already spent an hour telling him various things that required trust, and he was running low. Kalik's representative at the shuttle bay was not Kalik. It was a thin person in an administrative uniform, bearing the Vrath hegemony's balanced scale, with close-cropped hair and the same slightly translucent gray skin, who introduced himself as an independent documentation specialist, not a Vrath employee, he specified, an independent contractor, and who laid 3 documents on the cargo bay floor with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom documented delivery was a routine service function. Standard maritime registration continuation, the specialist said, vessel stewardship acknowledgement, and a basic liability waiver covering the transit period while you determine your long-term plans. All 3 are straightforward. Rin had picked up the first document and was reading it. Her eyes moved faster than Marcus had expected, scanning the pages with an intensity that was not the intensity of someone checking boxes. Marcus, she said while she was still reading, don't. I appreciate you taking care of this. Marcus said, because he was already looking at where to sign on the first page, because the first page had the summary paragraphs, and the summary paragraphs sounded exactly like what the specialist had described. And Marcus had spent 14 months not reading anything carefully, and the habit was very deeply grooved. He signed the first document. Marcus. Rin's voice had changed, still controlled, but with something under the control, something tight, like a cable under too much load. That second document. All 3 are related, the specialist said pleasantly. They form a single package legally, very standard. Marcus signed the second document. Rin put down the first one. She said nothing more. Marcus signed the third document, handed the set back to the specialist, and thanked him. And the specialist said, "You're very welcome," and retreated to the shuttle, and was gone in 3 minutes. Marcus turned to find Rin looking at him with an expression that was flat in the way of something that has recently made a decision about how much it will show and has landed on? Not much. What, he said. Nothing, she said, yet. He would remember the yet later, in the way that you remember the single word that contained everything. The message from Kalik came 40 minutes after that, routed through official Vrath hegemony channels with the formal headers and authentication codes of a diplomatic communication. It was addressed to all parties currently associated with the vessel Galactic Wanderer II and its registered steward. It informed them, politely, that the Grand Administrator of the Vrath hegemony would be honored to present the findings of a recent administrative review to the full Galactic Council at the earliest available session, and that all interested parties were cordially invited to attend. Vilhari, reading the same message on her own channel, sent Marcus a single sentence. This is not an invitation. Sora's message was longer. It said, be careful what you said yes to in the last several hours, not just today, particularly in the last 2. Marcus looked at the signed copies that the specialist had left him. Because the specialist had left him signed copies as a courtesy, which was routine practice in formal documentation. He looked at the summary paragraphs on the first page. He looked at where the complete text of the documents could be found, which was linked through an authorization code at the bottom of the first page. He did not access the full text. He set the copies aside because he was about to navigate through a transit corridor, and that required attention. He thought about Rin's face when she'd put the document down. He thought about the word yet. He did not think about it enough, not yet. The transit corridor between the outer Saturnian system and the Galactic Council's neutral jurisdiction took 9 hours at the Viridian Accord's standard drive output, which was steady and completely functional, in a way that Marcus found both reassuring and somehow at odds with the condition of everything else on the ship. Rin had spent the first 3 hours in what she called a security assessment of the hull systems, but what Marcus suspected was mostly a systematic examination of what the ship actually contained, because she came back from it with the particular expression of someone who has found as they expected to find and is now sitting with the implications. Vilhari maintained formation off the port side, communicating in bursts operational data, transit clearances, the occasional dry observation about the Council's procedural quirks. Marcus was, learning, someone who communicated primarily in function. Everything Vilhari said had a use. When she said something that did not have an obvious use, she expected you to find the use yourself. Sora's ship kept pace to starboard, and Sora herself had come aboard after the transit jump, moving through the corridors of the Viridian Accord with the same slow, memory-weighted attention she'd given the hull from the outside. She paused at thresholds. She put her hands against the bulkheads sometimes. She did not explain any of this, and Marcus did not ask, because something about the way she did it made asking feel like interrupting a prayer. Kalik's ship was behind them and slightly above, visible on the aft sensor display as a consistent point of dark hull and running lights. At hour 4, the ship that had been silent and stable for 9,000 years decided to have a diagnostic opinion about the aft cargo bay, which sent a low pulse of notification through the secondary console that Marcus almost missed, because he was trying to figure out why the galley heating unit worked for some things and not others. He went aft to check. The aft cargo bay was empty, as it had been when he boarded. The diagnostic pulse had not come from the cargo bay itself, but from the wall behind it, specifically from behind a panel that was the same color as the surrounding bulkhead, and would have been completely invisible if the diagnostic notification hadn't lit the edge of it with a faint amber line. Marcus stood in the empty cargo bay and looked at the panel. He pressed on it. Experimentally, nothing happened. He pressed the corners in sequence, which produced nothing except the impression that he should probably stop pressing things he didn't understand. He tried the key, the physical key with the registration number, in the small slot at the panel's lower edge that he hadn't noticed until he was close enough to see it properly. The panel opened. Inside was a secondary compartment, approximately the size of a large closet, that contained a single chair, a console of considerably more sophisticated design than anything in the cockpit, and a storage system of the kind used for permanent archive, dense, stable, built to survive without maintenance for very long periods of time. The console was active in the standby sense, lights cycling slowly through amber and green, waiting. Above the console, a small panel bore text in 3 scripts, 2 of which Marcus couldn't read, and one of which was in a form of standard galactic common that had been updated several times since this version was written, but that he could parse with some effort. The text said, "Steward access, full registry available." He sat in the chair. He put the key against the console surface. The archive opened. He read for 2 hours. Later, he would not be able to explain it well, the particular quality of those 2 hours. Sitting alone in the archive compartment of the Viridian Accord while the ship moved through transit, reading 9,000 years of stewardship records, legal documentation, historical summaries, and operational specifications in a mix of scripts and languages that the console helpfully translated in real time with occasional annotations where the translation was imprecise. He read about the Galactic Compact, what it was, why it had been written, what it had prevented, and how many times in the centuries since its signing various factions had tried to erode it, bypass it, or simply ignore it and then been reminded, sometimes violently, that ignoring the compact had consequences. He read about the role of the steward, which was older than the compact itself. The concept predated the specific document by several thousand years, rooted in the practice of a neutral vessel whose captain was bound by covenant to recognize no side in any dispute except the side of the agreement that stopped the dispute. He read about how the compact had formalized this into law, and how the Viridian Accord had become the physical embodiment of that formalization, present at the signing and thereafter registered as the steward's vessel in perpetuity. He read about what the vessel could do. There was a system. He'd assumed the ship was primarily historical significant because of what it represented, not because of what it could accomplish. He was wrong. Buried in the operational specifications, under a section labeled Emergency Arbitration Protocols that had not been updated since the original registration because it hasn't been perfectly adequate when written, and nothing had changed about physics or the need for emergency arbitration in 9,000 years, was a description of the Arbiter Protocol. He read this section 3 times. Then he read the documents that the Vrath specialist had given him. The full text accessed through the authorization code at the bottom of the first page, which he should have accessed 4 hours ago. The first document was what it claimed to be, a maritime registration continuation. The second document was a standard liability waiver. The third document was a declaration of voluntary dissolution of the Galactic Compact, to be executed by the Compact steward in good standing, signed by the steward at the bottom of page 7, with the date and vessel registration filled in, and the words, "In full understanding of the legal implications" on the line above the signature. The legal implications were described in the text of the document. Marcus had signed the line. The Vrath specialist had witnessed it. Marcus sat in the archive chair for a moment after that. The kind of moment that is very still on the outside and quite loud on the inside. He thought about 11 years of reading fine print. He thought about the 14 months of not reading anything carefully. He thought about signing the severance package without reading it, and the lease termination, and the storage unit agreement, and all the rest of them, and how none of that had mattered, because those documents were exactly what they appeared to be. He thought about Rin saying, "Yet." He went to find them. They were in the forward section of the ship, all 3 of them, which was unusual enough. He hadn't seen the 3 of them in the same space since they'd each made their separate cases to him. They were not together in the sense of being in conversation. They were adjacent to each other in the way of people who have each separately decided to be somewhere and have ended up in the same somewhere without coordinating. Velhari stood at the viewport, looking at the transit corridor's passage of stars. Sora sat cross-legged on the floor in a way that seemed natural to her frame. Rin was leaning against the bulkhead with her arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular. All 3 of them turned when he came in. Marcus held up the 3rd document. "This is a dissolution for the Galactic Compact," he said. "I signed it 4 hours ago. I didn't read it." The quality of silence that followed had different textures in it from each of them. Velhari's was the silence of someone running tactical scenarios. Sora's was the silence of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, not because she had known it was coming today, but because she had known something like it would come, eventually, and had been prepared. Rin's was the silence of someone looking at a thing they almost stopped and did not stop. "Tell me what I need to know," Marcus said, "all of it. Not the political version. Not the version where each of you is still angling for the arrangement that helps your faction most. the actual version. Another silence. Then Velhari said, with the flatness of someone setting something down that they've been carrying, the Vrath hegemony has wanted the compact dissolved for 200 years. Primary constraint on their territorial expansion. The compact requires unanimous council agreement for any acquisition of inhabited space. Vrath has been repeatedly blocked. The dissolution document, if presented to the council as a voluntary act by the recognized steward, Sora said, would initiate a formal review period of 30 days, during which the compact's protections are suspended pending the review's outcome. Vrath has sufficient council influence to ensure that outcome favors dissolution. And during those 30 days, Rin said, not looking at the wall anymore but at Marcus, the Free Worlds Coalition has no legal protection against absorption. Neither does any smaller polity under compact protection, Velhari said, including several Dominion client states. The Conclave has no fleet, Sora said quietly. We have never needed one. The compact has been the fleet. Marcus looked at the document. He looked at his signature on page 7, which was his actual signature, completely real, that he'd put there in the cargo bay of his own ship because a man in an administrative uniform had called it a standard liability waiver, and he had not read past the summary paragraph. The document isn't valid, he said. 3 pairs of eyes, counting Sora's 4, went to him. Contracts signed under misrepresentation of content are void, Marcus said. The specialist introduced the document as a liability waiver. The document is not a liability waiver. That's fraud in the inducement. Under any legal system I know of, that voids the instrument entirely. He paused. But they're going to present it to the council before anyone can raise a challenge, because at the council session, it will be presented as valid, and by the time the challenge is formalized, the 30-day review period will already be in motion. He thought about this. I need to be at that session. You need to officially declare yourself steward at that session, Velhari said, which you have not done. You have ownership of the vessel. You have not formally assumed the role. What does formally assuming the role mean? It means you cannot undeclare it, Sora said. The steward's role, once formally assumed before the council, is a permanent status. You could transfer stewardship of the vessel, but you cannot rescind the declaration. Marcus thought about Denver, about the apartment he'd sold, and the storage unit, and the sublet vehicle, and the general architecture of a life that had been easy to leave, because none of it had felt particularly held. He thought about what it would mean to stand in front of the Galactic Council and say, "This is who I am now." He thought about Rin saying, "Tell me the politics-free version," and he'd been the one who said it, and the 3 of them had given it to him, which had cost them something, and he could tell. I can prove the document is fraudulent, he said. I photographed the specialist who gave it to me. If I can verify that he's a Vrath operative and not an independent contractor, the fraud is demonstrable. Do any of you have access to Vrath personnel records? Velhari said. The Dominion has intelligence assets within the hegemony. Sora said. The Conclave has access to biometric registries that predate the current hegemony administration. Rin said. The Coalition has 4 people inside Vrath territorial space right now. They would very much like a reason to be useful. Marcus held up his phone. I have a photograph of his face, time-stamped. The shuttle bay's internal logs will have him on record arriving and departing. He looked at the 3 of them. If you can match the face to a Vrath officer registry, we can walk into that council session with actual evidence. The 3 women looked at each other in the same way they'd looked at each other on the screens at Titanport, except this time it was different in kind. The first look had been 3 parties recalibrating around an unexpected variable. This look was 3 parties recognizing something they hadn't come here expecting to find, and having the same thought about it at the same time. We can do this, Velhari said, and it was the first time in their acquaintance that Marcus had heard her say anything without at least one layer of strategic qualification underneath it. We'll need to work together, Rin said, which was also, from her, clearly not a sentence she said often. Sora said nothing. She looked at Marcus with all 4 eyes, with the expression of someone observing a geological formation and seeing that it is not what it appeared from the initial angle, but something older, something with more architecture in it than the surface suggested. You stopped running, she said. It wasn't a question. It also wasn't precisely about today. Marcus thought about this for a moment. "I stopped running 4 hours ago," he said, "when I found what was in the archive compartment. I've been reading ever since." Sora's expression shifted the way light shifts on still water when something under the surface moves. It was not a smile, exactly. It was something that was adjacent to a smile in the way that conviction is adjacent to hope. "Then we have work to do," she said, "and not much time to do it." The Galactic Council's neutral station was not designed to impress. This was, Marcus had read in the archive, a deliberate choice made by the Compact's founders, who had reasoned that architecture meant to awe was architecture that communicated hierarchy, and the Council existed specifically to assert that no party in any negotiation was inherently above any other. The result was a station that was large, genuinely vast, built for species of wildly different sizes, but plain in a way that was itself a kind of statement. All clean surfaces and functional design, and the particular dignity of things that do not try to demonstrate their own importance. The docking bay was full. Marcus had not been prepared for how full. The sensor display on approach had shown him 43 vessels in queue, ranging from shuttle-sized to fleet carrier-sized, and when they'd cleared approach authorization and moved into the bay proper, he could see the insignia of species he'd never heard of on hulls whose configurations he had no reference for. He had known, academically, that the Galactic Council represented a significant number of member species. Knowing it and arriving at the place where they were all present for a session that had been convened specifically around the document in his jacket pocket were different experiences. Velhari had arranged their entry as part of a formal Dominion diplomatic delegation, which gave them security clearance and a direct corridor to the council chamber. She walked in front, because she was the highest-ranking person in their group, under any framework that the council's protocol systems recognized, and she walked the way she did everything, with the precise economy of someone who does not waste movement. Rin walked behind Marcus and to his left, which he had noticed was a position she seemed to default to, and which he had eventually understood was a defensive position. She had placed herself between him and whatever might approach from that angle. He had not pointed this out. He had found it quietly useful. Sora walked beside him. The council chamber was circular and tiered, built around a central floor space that was currently empty, and the tiers rose steeply enough that Marcus, standing on the floor level, could see representatives of over 30 species arranged above him in a ring that felt simultaneously judicial and theatrical. Kalik was already there. He was standing at the floor level on the opposite side of the chamber, with a delegation of Forvreth representative arranged behind him, and he held a document case that Marcus recognized as the same case that the specialist had carried into the cargo bay. Kalik saw Marcus and his delegation enter. His expression did not change. His eyes, those unbroken silver surfaces that gave away nothing, moved across the group and settled briefly on the phone in Marcus's hand before moving away again. He did not alter the smile. He returned his attention to the council representative currently speaking. Marcus had not taken the phone out for any reason. He had been holding it because he found having something in his hand grounding, which was a thing he'd discovered during his second year of contract work, when the documents got complex enough that he needed to stay physically present to stay mentally present. He hadn't planned to make anything of Kalik seeing it. He filed the micro-reaction anyway. The session opened with the standard administrative procedures that the compact required, which Velhari had briefed him on, and which took 22 minutes. Marcus stood at the floor level and watched Kalik, who was patient in the way that people are patient when they are confident about the outcome and are simply waiting for the process to reach it. Then the administrator pro tem, a being of a species Marcus didn't recognize, wide, four-armed, with a voice that resonated in registers above and below his comfortable hearing range, called the item on the agenda. Kalik stepped forward. He was good. Marcus had known he would be good, but watching him in the council chamber, Marcus understood that Kalik was specifically, precisely excellent in the way that very few people were excellent, the kind of excellent that came from doing one specific thing for a very long time with absolute commitment to doing it well. He spoke in measured, warm, completely reasonable terms. He expressed sincerely his admiration for the Galactic Compact and all that it represented. He acknowledged the significance of the present situation. He produced the document case, placed it on the floor in front of him, and opened it with the care of someone handling something important. The compact steward, Kalik said, in full exercise of the authority granted under Section 4 of the Compact, and with full awareness of the legal implications of the Act, has signed a declaration of voluntary dissolution, initiating the formal review period provided for under Compact law. He held up the document. The signature is verified. The vessel registration is confirmed. The document is complete and properly executed. The chamber had a particular quality of silence after this that Marcus would have called stunned if he hadn't known that many of the species present couldn't be stunned in any human sense. It was more like the silence of something that has been in motion for a very long time and has suddenly encountered the end of the track and not yet fallen. Vilhari, beside him, said nothing. Rin, behind him, said nothing. Sora, to his right, touched his arm once, very lightly, and then withdrew her hand. Marcus stepped forward. He had expected this to feel larger, this moment, in the way that important moments in stories feel large when you read them. It did not feel large. It felt very specific and immediate and not particularly dramatic, because he was thinking about what he had to do and in what order, and when you are focused on the sequence, the drama gets smaller. He had spent 11 years focused on sequences. It was one of the 2 or 3 things he was genuinely good at. I need to speak, he said to the room. The administrator pro tem's 4 arms moved in what Marcus had learned was the gestural equivalent of a neutral acknowledgement. The matter is before the council. Interested parties may address. My name is Marcus Webb, he said. I am the registered owner of the vessel Galactic Wanderer 2, Registry 7741 Theka, previously known as the Viridian Accord. He paused 1 beat. I am formally declaring myself Compact Steward. The silence in the chamber had a new quality now. Kalik, across the floor, held his expression with the care of someone who has been surprised but will not show it, because showing it concedes something. The declaration is noted, the administrator pro tem said, and formally recorded. Marcus heard Vilhari exhale. Very quietly, behind him. He knew what that exhalation meant. He had said it, it was permanent. He had known that when he stepped forward, and he was trying not to think too specifically about it because he still had things to do. Regarding the document Grand Administrator Kalek has presented, Marcus said, I'm going to ask the council to take note of several things. The first is that the document was presented to me as a standard liability waiver. It is not.
I did not know what I was signing because I was not told what I was signing. He looked at Kalek. That is fraud in the inducement,
And under any legal framework I have found in
9,000 years of compact records, it voids the instrument.
Kalek's smile shifted slightly. Not much. A degree. The steward signed the document voluntarily, he said, still addressing the administrator pro tem rather than Marcus directly, which was a tactical choice. It kept the conversation in formal registers rather than direct ones. The content of the document was available upon request. The specialist who presented it introduced it as a liability waiver, Marcus said. That's misrepresentation of content. But I understand that's my word against the Grand Administrators. He reached into his jacket and took out his phone. So I want to show the council something. He navigated to the photograph, the one he'd taken in the cargo bay, when the specialist had been spreading the documents on the floor, time-stamped, clear, showing the specialist's face in direct light at close range, with the cargo bay's interior visible behind him and the registration markings on the wall, legible in the frame. Elder Sora, Marcus said. Sora stepped forward. She was carrying a data tablet. She had been carrying it since they boarded, in the methodical way of someone who came to important events prepared, and she connected it to the council's display system with the ease of someone who had done this before. The Conclave maintains biometric records of all registered diplomatic personnel operating under galactic credentials, Sora said. Her voice in the council chamber was remarkable. The harmonic in it seemed to expand, to fill the space, without her raising it at all. At the Compact Steward's request, I ran a biometric comparison between this photograph and the hegemony's registered diplomatic personnel. The result? She looked up at the council. All four eyes moving across the tiers is a confirmed match. The individual who presented these documents to the steward and introduced himself as an independent contractor is Hegemony Internal Operations Officer 3rd Class Dresh Valek, assigned to Administrator Kalek's office. Rin, from somewhere behind Marcus, said with great precision and very little volume, "There it is." Vilhari was already moving. She had, it turned out, the Dominion's intelligence summary open on her own tablet and had already coordinated with Sora during the 9-hour transit in ways Marcus had not fully tracked, because they had stopped being rivals at some point around hour 6 and had started being something more like colleagues with a common problem, which in Marcus's experience was how most productive working relationships started. The Dominion confirms the identification, Vilhari said. We also have shuttle bay departure logs from Titanport, confirming that the vessel bearing this officer departed the port at the exact time the documentation transfer concluded, using a Vrath Hegemony Transit authorization code filed under a false commercial registry. The Administrator Pro Tem's forearms moved again, in a configuration that looked, even without being able to read it, like the gestural equivalent of a significant development. Kalik was still standing exactly where he'd been standing. He had not moved. He had not looked away from the Administrator Pro Tem. He was still smiling, but the smile had become something different. It had become the smile of someone who is holding very still. Because they are in the process of deciding what the next move is, and they know that stillness is less revealing than motion. The document is fraudulent, he said, and his voice was still perfectly level, which Marcus had to respect even as he recognized what it was. We accept this finding. The hegemony will conduct an internal review of how this error occurred. A pause. However, the question of the Compact Steward's role remains before this council regardless of the document's status. The Compact has been without an active steward for 9,000 years. The question of whether that represents a material lapse. The Compact Steward has formally declared, the Administrator Pro Tem said. The declaration is recorded. The question of lapse is moot. Kalik's smile stayed in place. Then the council will certainly appreciate the hegemony's perspective on the matter of. He did not finish the sentence. The reason Kalik did not finish the sentence was that his comm unit, and Velhari's comm unit, and Rin's comm unit, and the council chamber's own communication systems all registered an alert simultaneously. Marcus's phone buzzed in his hand, and he looked at it and found a message from Velhari's operations officer that said Hegemony Fleet Assets Active Perimeter 20,000 kilometers. Rin's voice came from behind him, flat and precise, as a navigator reading coordinates. 37 vessels, sitting outside the council's neutral jurisdiction, not inside it, not yet. She paused, but positioned. Kalik looked at the Administrator Pro Tem. His smile was gone. What replaced it was something more honest and considerably more cold, the expression of someone who has two strategies and has just switched from the first one to the second. The hegemony would like the council to understand, he said, that regardless of the document's legal status, the question of the compact's continued viability is one that the broader galactic community has a significant interest in discussing. The hegemony is prepared to facilitate that discussion. Immediately, the chamber fell into a different kind of silence. Not stunned this time, calculating. Marcus had been expecting this. He had read the archive for 2 hours, and the archive contained the complete history of every crisis the compact had faced. And in every crisis, there had been the moment when the legal strategy failed and whoever was conducting it switched to the strategy of force, not necessarily because they wanted to use force, but because the threat of force was itself a negotiating instrument. He had known Kalek would switch when the legal argument failed. He had been wrong about one thing, though, which was the scale of the fleet Kalek had prepositioned. 37 vessels was not a show of force. 37 vessels, even outside the neutral perimeter, was a commitment. The council was looking at him. He realized, in the specific ways of someone unused to being the person a room of 30 species looks to, that he was the compact steward and the room full of 30 species was looking at him because that was what you did when you had a problem involving the compact. "Give me a moment," Marcus Webb said, and turned around and walked back toward his delegation. He was walking because he needed to think, and he thought better in motion, and he had something in his jacket pocket that he needed to decide whether to use. Rin fell into step beside him the moment he turned because she moved when he moved in the way of a person who had decided to provide cover without being asked to cover. "Talk to me," she said, low and quick, the words barely carrying past the two of them. "The archive," Marcus said, matching her quiet. "There's a system in the ship. I didn't have time to explain it in the transit because I needed everyone focused on the evidence." He kept his voice even, kept his pace unhurried because 37 alien species were watching them, And he had found through 11 years of professional experience that the way you moved in a room when things were uncertain was itself a communication. It's called the Arbiter Protocol, emergency peacekeeping measure. Original compact specification, never updated because it never needed to be. Rin was quiet for one step. Tell me. Broadcasts on all recognized frequencies from the Viridian Accords communication array. Sends a mandatory, weapon-safe signal to every armed vessel within 10,000 miles. Forces all weapons systems into non-operational mode for 48 hours. Can't be overridden. Can't be jammed. It's a hard-coded mandate in every ship built under compact specification for the last 9,000 years. Markets paused, which includes every ship in that fleet outside. Rin stopped walking. She stopped so completely that Marcus took 3 more steps before realizing and turning back to her. She was looking at him with an expression that was calculating something very fast. Every ship in the fleet was constructed under compact shipbuilding codes, she said. The Vrath have been compact members for 6,000 years. Their entire fleet is compact certified. That was my reading, Marcus said. Can you activate it from here? No, I have to be on the ship. Rin looked at him for another half second. Then she turned and walked, not back toward the delegation but toward Velhari. Marcus followed. What happened next was not a long conversation. Long conversations, Marcus had learned in the last day and a half, were not the natural mode of any of the 3 women he'd apparently agreed to co-stewardship arrangements with. What it was efficient. Rin told Velhari in 15 seconds. Velhari told Sora in approximately the same time. Sora had known about the Arbiter Protocol already. He saw it in her expression when the word reached her. The recognition of something confirmed rather than revealed. But her 4 eyes moved to Marcus with a new quality of attention, one that was less the geological patience of earlier and more the quality of absolute focus. You would need to reach the ship, Velhari said. Your ship is in the docking bay. Approximately 6 minutes at controlled transit speed. 3 if I don't control the speed, Marcus said. You cannot pilot that ship at speed through a docking bay that size without. I could co-pilot it, Rin said. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, which Marcus had learned was how she processed geometry. I've piloted smaller vessels in worse configurations. 3 minutes 40. I'll contact the administrator pro tem, Sora said, already moving, already pulling her data tablet. The council needs to know what is about to happen. Not to approve it, the Arbiter Protocol doesn't require council approval. It predates council approval, but to understand that the next 4 minutes are going to look alarming and be completely legal. Velhari looked at Marcus with those pale, precise eyes. If this works, she said, it removes the Vrath fleet's threat capacity for 48 hours. It does not resolve the political situation. It gives the council time to convene a formal response. It does not guarantee that response is adequate. 48 hours is enough time for the council to initiate formal sanctions procedures against a member species that mobilized an armed fleet against the neutral station, Marcus said. I checked. Article 29, Section 2. The threshold for sanctions initiation is documented fleet mobilization within 300,000 kilometers of council jurisdiction. They're inside that radius right now. They've already tripped the threshold. The council just hasn't voted on it yet, because they've been handling the document problem. Velhari looked at him for a moment with a quality of attention that he had not seen from her before, which was the attention of someone encountering something they had underestimated, and are now updating their assessment in real time. You have been reading, she said. For 9,000 years of it, Marcus said. Some things come up more than once. He turned to go. He had 2 steps done before Sora's voice reached him. Marcus. He stopped. He turned. Sora was standing where she had been standing, with her data tablet in hand, and she looked at him across the distance between them with all 4 eyes. And there was something in her expression that he did not have a name for because he had known her for approximately 18 hours and had not yet cataloged all the things her face could mean. This is not required of you, she said. The moral declaration is made. That is permanent. What you do next is still a choice. Marcus held this for a moment. He thought about Denver and the storage unit and the sublease and the 14 months of not particularly caring what happened. He thought about the man in the Traveler Services Hall who had said good luck and meant it in a way that only made sense now. That Marcus understood what he'd handed over, and to whom. He thought about the archive compartment and 2 hours of reading. and the moment when he'd understood what the ship could do, and the feeling that had arrived alongside that understanding, which was the specific feeling of a person who has spent a long time not having a reason for anything, suddenly having one. "I know," he said. "I'm going anyway." Sora nodded once, slowly, as if recording something. The run to the docking bay was not, in the end, 3 minutes 40. It was 4 minutes 12 because the corridor access system required an override clearance that Velhari provided remotely from the council chamber in the time it took Marcus and Rin to arrive at the corridor junction, and Velhari providing it while also maintaining her position in the chamber. And managing the comm traffic from the Dominion's tactical officers outside required the kind of divided attention that Marcus was learning was one of Velhari's primary professional skills. They ran. Rin ran at a pace that Marcus could keep up with, which he suspected was not her natural pace. She ran with one ear on the comm traffic, audible through her earpiece, and she said nothing for the entire 4 minutes because she was tracking multiple things simultaneously, and conversation was not currently on the list. The Viridian Accord was where they'd left it, docked in Bay 17, and it was already cycling through a low-power readiness state that Marcus hadn't initiated. He looked at this for a half-second as he ran up the boarding ramp. "Did the ship do that on its own?" he asked. "Yes," Rin said behind him. It's 9,000 years old and it knows what the Arbiter Protocol is," Rin said. "Stop asking questions and get to the archive compartment." The archive compartment Marcus had left the panel open when they departed, for the council chamber was accessible in 40 seconds at a run from the boarding ramp. He dropped into the chair. The console was active, more active than it had been, cycling through amber and green faster than before, in the way of something that has been waiting for a very long time, and is now aware that waiting is almost over. He put the key against the console surface. The console responded immediately. A display unfolded from the surface, not holographic in the way he was used to from the ship's other systems, but something older and more direct, text and schematics and status readouts in that same slightly archaic form of galactic common. He navigated to the section he'd read during transit, the Arbiter Protocol. He found the activation sequence. It was, he had noted when he first read it, remarkably simple. 9,000 years of engineers had apparently agreed that the activation sequence for a galaxy-wide emergency peacekeeping measure should be something a distressed person could execute without error, because emergency peacekeeping measures were by definition needed in conditions of distress. 3 commands in sequence: confirm, confirm, execute. "Rin," he called, loud enough to carry through the ship. "If this works, you're going to feel something." "The weapon systems on your sidearm already offline," she called back from the cockpit. "Felt it start the moment you put the key in. The protocol's already handshaking with the receivers." Marcus looked at the display. He looked at the 3 commands. He thought for one precise and unplanned moment about what this meant. Not for the Council, or the Compact, or the 37-ship fleet outside. Just what it meant for him, sitting in a chair in a secret compartment of a ship he'd bought for 4,200 credits, about to press the most consequential button he had ever pressed in his life, which included all 11 years of buttons pressed in law firm offices that had eventually decided he was a recalibrating priority. He pressed confirm. He pressed confirm again. He pressed execute. The Viridian Accord's communication array, the one that had been serviced recently, he understood now, because the previous steward, whoever they had been, had made sure it would work when it was needed, sent a signal that expanded outward at the propagation speed of hard-coded receiver protocols, which was to say, immediately, in all directions, hitting every ship within 10,000 miles in what was measurably less than 1 second. Marcus felt the ship vibrate, not with engine stress, with transmission, a 9,000-year-old voice speaking in a frequency that every ship in the fleet had been manufactured to hear. From the cockpit, Rin said, "Fleet weapons, all systems, going dark, 37 ships, 37 crews," making the noise of systems shutting down that they had never expected to shut down, in configurations they were not built to resist. "Weapons targeting, offline. Drive weapons, offline. Close-range defensive arrays, offline. 48 hours, encoded in a mandate that their own hulls had been built to honor." Marcus sat in the archive chair for a moment without moving. Then Rin's voice came through the ship's internal speakers. "You need to get back to the chamber." "I know. I mean, you need to get back now."
The council is trying to understand what just happened, and Sora
Can only explain so many things at once. I'm coming. He stood. He looked at the console for one more moment. He looked at the display that showed the signal still broadcasting. It would broadcast for the full 48 hours, the archive said, whether or not anyone remained on the ship to maintain it. He went back to the council chamber. The next 4 hours were the kind that Marcus had encountered occasionally in his professional life, in the very few moments when something genuinely larger had been at stake, in case he was working on hours that compressed into memory as a series of clear, distinct images rather than a continuous experience, as if his brain was being selective about what it kept in full resolution. He remembered Colic standing at the floor level of the council chamber when Marcus returned, and the conversation that followed was not the diplomatic conversation Colic had been conducting before. It was something more direct and more honest, and it turned out that Colic, stripped of the legal strategy that had been his primary tool, was still a very intelligent person who was capable of recognizing when a position was no longer defensible. You've bought the council 48 hours, Colic said. That doesn't resolve the underlying situation. The underlying situation, Marcus said, is that you mobilized 37 ships within 300,000 kilometers of the council neutral station, which is documented fleet aggression under Article 29. That's not my position. That's the Compact's position. I didn't write it. The Compact's enforcement mechanisms have not been tested in centuries. Then it's a good time to test them, Marcus said. Colic looked at him for a long moment. The silver eyes that gave nothing away were doing the work of several different expressions at once, and Marcus had learned enough about him in the last day to be able to read approximately 3 of them. There was calculation. There was the recognition of the difference between a setback and a defeat, and there was, unexpectedly, something that was almost respect in the way of one professional, acknowledging the work of another professional, in a situation where they happened to be on opposite sides. The hegemony, Colic said, will require assurance that the review process is conducted fairly. The Compact's review process is what it is, Marcus said. I didn't write that either. But if the hegemony's concerns about Compact governance are genuine rather than strategic, the process exists to raise them. I'll note them to the council formally. That's the steward's role. Colic's expression shifted, finally, from one configuration to another, and what settled on his face was something that Marcus would have called resignation if it hadn't looked slightly more like the expression of someone who has decided to try a genuinely different approach and is not entirely displeased about it. You're not what we planned for, Colic said. No, Marcus said. I know. The council vote on Compact sanctions against the Vrath hegemony for the documented fleet mobilization. Article 29, Section 2. The threshold clearly met. The process initiated formally by the administrator pro tem ran parallel to a second proceeding in which the hegemony's legal team challenged the sanctions threshold interpretation, and Marcus sat at the floor level of the council chamber for 6 hours reading Compact law in real time from the archive's mobile interface and flagging every citation the hegemony's team raised with the specific section that addressed it. He had not expected this to be the experience. He had expected something more dramatic, but drama, he was rediscovering, was largely a production of insufficient information. When you had the information, what you had instead was work. Velhari sat beside him for the first 2 hours, then went to manage the Dominion delegation's part of the proceedings. Rin remained in the docking bay with the Viridian Accord, monitoring the protocol's transmission. She sent updates at intervals, concise and exact. Signal stable, fleet weapons confirmed offline, no attempts to circumvent. Sora moved through the chamber the way she moved through all spaces, slowly and thoroughly, and she ended up in conversation with 3 council members who Marcus didn't recognize. And whatever she was saying to them, the expressions on their faces or the face equivalents their physiologies produced were the expressions of people being told something that rearranges their understanding of something they thought they already knew. The sanctions vote passed at 19 hours and 37 minutes into the session, by a margin that Velhari told him afterward was larger than any sanctions vote in council history for the last 400 years. The Vrath hegemony was formally censured. The fleet outside was required to withdraw under council jurisdiction escort, and a review process was initiated that the hegemony's legal team would participate in whether they wanted to or not. because the alternative was escalated sanctions that they could not afford. Kalik, in his final statement to the council, said that the hegemony accepted the findings and would cooperate with the review process. He looked once at Marcus before he finished. His expression was the expression of someone who has lost a significant contest and is deciding whether to categorize the loss as a defeat or an education. Marcus thought it might be both. He was not unsympathetic. After was the council chamber emptying over the course of an hour, and Marcus sitting in one of the floor-level seats that were scaled for beings considerably larger than him, and the quiet of a very large space when the proceedings are done. He had a headache. He had not eaten properly in about 20 hours. His back hurt in the way that backs hurt when a person has been sitting in chairs of the wrong size for an extended period. Sora was the first one back. She moved through the chamber toward him the way she moved through all spaces, and she sat beside him on the floor, not in the seat, on the floor, cross-legged, because that was apparently more comfortable for her than the seats, which were scaled for different physiologies, and she'd had 400 years to determine her preferences. "How do you feel?" she said. "I have a headache," Marcus said. "Yes," she said. "That is what it feels like." Velhari returned next, with the precise controlled bearing of someone who has been professionally excellent for a very long time under very difficult conditions, and does not intend to stop being professionally excellent now that the difficult conditions are temporarily resolved. But she sat down. She sat in the seat beside Marcus, and she was quiet for a moment, which was different from her other silences, and Marcus thought, this is what it looks like when Velhari rests. Rin came last, from the docking bay, and she came in the same way she'd entered the cargo bay at Titanport all those hours ago, in motion, covering distance, arriving rather than appearing. She stopped at the edge of the floor space, looked at the three of them, and said, "Protocol is stable. 48 hours from activation." She looked at Marcus, "Which gives us 46 hours and change." "I know," Marcus said. "After that, the fleet weapons come back online. The council escort will have moved them, but Vrath has other assets." "I know." Rin was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down on the other side of Marcus, not in the seat to his left but on the floor beside the seat, her back against the tier wall, long legs stretched out in front of her, which was a posture he would not have guessed she took. She looked, for perhaps the first time since he'd met her, like someone who was not performing a role. "You declared yourself steward," she said. "Yes, you can't undeclare it. I know that too." She looked at the ceiling. "We came to this station with 3 separate proposals, 3 separate arrangements, each designed to give us leverage we needed." She paused. "That's not what happened." "No," Marcus said. "It isn't." The silence that followed among the 4 of them was different from all the silences that had come before it. Not the recalibration silence of Titanport, not the tactical silence of transit, not the tense silence of the council proceedings. It was the silence of people who are done, for now, with the necessary thing, and are sitting in the afterward together, which is its own distinct experience. "The bonding compact proposals," Marcus said after a while. "Yes," Velhari said. "They're still on the table." A pause. "If you choose." Marcus thought about this. He thought about it in the way he was starting to think about things now, which was different from how he'd thought about things 14 months ago, present to the details, attentive to the clauses, actually in the situation he was in, rather than slightly adjacent to it. He thought about what 3 separate bonding compacts meant for 3 separate species and their relationship to the compact. He thought about what they meant for him. He thought about all 3 of them, sitting in this chamber with him, and what he knew about each of them that he hadn't known 36 hours ago. "Ask me again," he said, "when the 48 hours are over and we've seen what happens next." Another silence, different in texture from the one before. "That's not a no," Rin said. "It's not a no," Marcus said. Sora made a sound that was quiet and low and had the harmonic in it, and it took Marcus a moment to identify it, because he hadn't heard her do it before, and then he recognized it. She was laughing, in the contained, private way of something that finds a situation genuinely and deeply funny, rather than performatively so.
"What?" he said. 412 years, she said.
16 compact stewards, 9 significant crises.
47 formal bonding compact proposals across the span of recorded steward history.
She looked at him with all 4 eyes. Not one of them asked to be asked again. "It seemed polite," Marcus said. Velhari made a sound. It was very small and very brief, and Marcus was fairly confident, on reflection, that it was a laugh. Rin stretched her legs further out and crossed them at the ankle and said nothing. But she was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone who is trying to decide something and is inclined to decide it in a specific direction and is not quite ready to say so yet. Marcus leaned back in the seat, his head still hurt. He was tired in the complete way of someone who has been present for something genuinely large and has now arrived at the end of it, or at least at the end of this part of it. He knew there was more. 46 hours until the protocol ended. The Council's sanctions process, stretching forward, the Compact's first active steward in 9,000 years, and everything that meant, in every practical direction. He knew all of this. He was thinking about it in the background, the way he'd spent 11 years thinking about the implications of complex documents while outwardly seeming very calm. But for now, in the chamber that had emptied out around them, with 3 alien women who had arrived to acquire leverage and had ended up somewhere else entirely, Marcus Webb was thinking about 4,200 credits and a man in a terminal who'd said good luck and meant something larger than what it sounded like. He was thinking that for the first time in a very long time, he was not adjacent to his own life. He was in it.